Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Talent Parent Programme, the Adolescent Brain webinar. So thank you for accessing this webinar this evening, which marks our first one being delivered in 2019. My name is Daniel Thompson and I am the Talent Programme Administration Officer for British Canoeing. So delivering this webinar remotely this evening is Stephen Eccles, who is a volunteer psychologist for the England Talent Programme. I hope that you've had a chance to listen to some of the previously delivered webinars as part of this programme. If you haven't, then the full videos are currently on the Talent Parent Programme webpage under the Webinars and Video Resources tab. So hopefully you should all be able to hear myself, and as we progress with this webinar this evening, you should be able to see the presentation too. For those of you who haven't accessed the webinar before, during the webinar, you'll see that there's a chat feature below. If you click on this, you can drop a message to us, which allows all the attendees to see this during the presentation. I believe that this platform will be utilised as part of tonight's webinar. So may I ask that you ensure that you have yourself muted during the presentation and that your camera is turned off. There should be a red mic button at the top of the screen to enable this. So this evening, we'll be presenting the Adolescent Brain webinar by Stephen Eccles. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Stephen.
That's great. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the adolescent brain. It's greatly appreciated that you probably have a lot of priorities to tend to, so I'm hoping this is really useful. I also wanted to let you know, as Daniel said, I may ask for some audience participation throughout, like I did in my last webinar. Please write any comments that you have in the chat box when requested, and hopefully that will make for a fruitful discussion. So, before we get into the breakdown of what we'll be discussing today, it's worthwhile to know that when we speak about the adolescent brain, we're of course focusing on child development, which can be described as a continuous process, includes a variety of developments such as cognitive, behavioural and emotional, and most importantly, it's unique for every individual. So, for today, I want to cover a couple of topics. Growing up in 2019 and how that may differ from growing up in previous years. I want us to take a greater look at the adolescent brain and how it differs from an adult brain, which will follow quite nicely onto what's happening with the chemicals in our brain and how that might affect their behaviour. Some of you may have heard about the chimp paradox, the human, the chimp and the computer. So I'd like to use that to help paint the picture of what is going on in the head of an adolescent. Then finally, we'll touch on the emotional control and how you can help your son or daughter through the difficult periods. I've tried to use some sport-specific examples throughout, and hopefully they'll help paint that picture. And once again, thank you for joining us tonight. So, growing up in 2019. Now, before we actually progress, I'd like us to step back in time. And in the chat, can you give me a few words to describe yourself when you was an adolescent? Again, it doesn't have to be anything too fancy. It's just be really great to just get your understanding, get your point of view. Thank you very much. Got shy in early years, to be fair, and I hold my hands up. I was messy. Thank you, Stephen. Moody and obstructive. Any more? Could we have at least two more to make it interesting? Totally agree, not a child or an adult. I think that's a really good point because it is that kind of weird phase where we are progressing, we are developing, and almost we want to do things by ourselves, but we're still learning at the same time. So no, I think that's a really great point. Any final ones? Again, it doesn't have to be anything too fancy. And energetic all the time. That's a very fair point as well. I wish I was energetic now. Okay, and not concentrating. I think that's, again, it's interesting that we want to concentrate sometimes, but the least thing kind of, oh, what's that? Cool. Honestly, thank you very much for your participation in that. I'll go back to presentation. Okay, so as I said, thank you very much for your comments. I really appreciate that. And I find it interesting to discuss growing up in 2019, especially the term millennials and post-millennials is one about which can be associated with snowflakes and almost not being robust to challenges, etc. But times have changed in this modern era, and you can see a few examples on the slide. You know, you've got the mobile phones, you've got the abundance of social media, and we're now talking about more about our mental health. Now, let's just start with mobile phones. For many of us, the first mobile phone would have had an antenna stuck out of it, and if you'd have had a camera, you're quite lucky. Now, it seems that if you've not got a phone nowadays, you may be considered as odd. So already there's like kind of an additional kind of social pressure. And with that comes a pressure of always checking for messages, checking for news, checking, which, as you can imagine, can take a great deal of energy and time. Now, this leads on to the introduction of social media, which has taken society by storm. And let's face it, it's all of a sudden we're here, and it's just consumed our lives. And to name a few, we now have Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. So we're not just thinking about how we're seen in person, but we've actually got to have an online presence. And we're very conscious of the image that we portray to others, which again can cause a lot of stress. So not only are adolescents checking for messages, they're seeing what everybody else is doing and thus comparing, which again can cause a great deal of pressure whilst we're trying to grow up through that difficult period. Now, speaking of stress and how we nowadays, we're now so much more mindful of our mental health, not just our physical health anymore. And to address a myth, I know people say that the current generation are classed as snowflakes, but instead, aren't we just a lot more honest rather than hiding it away? Food for thought. But now I want you to keep this in the back of your mind, and let's focus on the adolescent brain. So, when we consider our brain, we probably don't break it down into the different parts. But as you can see, it's made up of the lizard brain, the mammal brain, and the human brain. And when we're growing up, the lizard brain and the mammal brain are in primary control. And as you can see, during adolescence, it's still developing. This region is still under construction, meaning that the ability to control our emotions, to plan effectively, might not be an adolescent's greatest ability. Therefore, this lack of development may be displayed as everything seems to be at the last minute, which may include getting ready for training. Almost like they seem to be very forgetful. And again, this can include like forgetting equipment such as water bottles. There may be occasions where your son or daughter shows severe mood swings and an apparent lack of control for behavior. They might not like taking instruction and just want to do their own thing and take more risks and things like that. Now, a good analogy I like to use is when we first buy a house. Or having work carried out on the kitchen, we've still got to cook, we've still got to live. But the kitchen might look like a bomb sitter and everything's all over the place. So we might just be able to use the microwave instead of using the oven or cooking from fresh. And let's face it, we might actually get fed up and stressed by having to deal with that. However, when the kitchen finally looks like a kitchen rather than a construction site, everything's, got done, it looks great and we can begin to function effectively. What I'm trying to say is that the development takes time. I need to understand that as an adolescent's brain isn't fully developed, they're not really going to think like we do yet. Now, it's not an excuse, but as we will discuss later, we need to provide support to help them get it right. Now, again, what's going on in there? So we've already mentioned that part of the brain is still under construction. But another reason why adolescents act differently is because of certain chemicals, neurotransmitters in the brain. And I've picked a couple out today. Some of you may already know what these are and some may not. But if we start with dopamine, dopamine helps us control our emotional response and the ability to experience pleasure and pain. Importantly, during adolescence, its levels decrease, resulting in mood swings and difficulties regulating emotion. In addition, serotonin plays a significant role in the mood alterations, anxiety, impulse control, and arousal. And believe it or not, its levels also decrease during adolescence. So again, chemicals in our brain are fluctuating, which impacts on our emotion and thus our behaviour. And finally, we may notice that our son and daughter might turn into night owls during adolescence. But then again, you may have been a night owl yourself. Now, again, this is because of the chemical neurotransmitter called melatonin, which is responsible for our sleep and awake cycle. And basically, that fluctuates as well, and thus our body's daily production of melatonin increases the requirement for sleep during adolescence. And again, what I want to do is provide you with a picture of what is going on in the adolescent brain. And this explains partially their behavior, which hopefully will help you as a parent understand that they're not behaving abruptly or stubbornly on purpose. Although, don't get me wrong, it might seem like that at the time. But actually, it's just sometimes because of what's going on upstairs, they've just got a bit of a lack of control of what's going on. But equally, we appreciate that when your son and daughter, for instance, is underwater, again, their emotions might be all over the place. And coaches and support staff, such as myself, need to also understand that. So we've got a part to play in this. Now, I want to go on to the chimp paradox. Again, I know some of you may have already heard about this, but those that haven't, the chimp paradox tries to explain what's happening in the mind. It uses the analogy of the human, the chimp, and the computer. And for today, I'll just focus on the chimp and the human. So let's begin with our chimp, our primate brain. Now, when our chimp wants something, they want it there and then, immediate gratification, and it's not happy when it doesn't get its way. An example of this on the water is how if they don't get it right or don't feel like they're doing well, they might get quickly frustrated. Therefore, on the car home, they feel like they're not doing well. And when you try and tell them that they're making great progress, they could actually respond in an argumentative manner. Because again, going back to the brain part, it's not functioning as well as we want because it's still under construction. And it's a great example of when the chimp has taken over. So there are times when our chimp becomes the dominant figure and it's highly sensitive to reward and highly sensitive to criticism. You know, it does throw a tantrum and the human brain, unfortunately, goes offline. And therefore, it does make it difficult for a productive conversation. But at this point, I think it's worthwhile to kind of go into the emotional development throughout adolescence. Now, I just want to pick up a couple of key points here through early adolescence, middle adolescence, and late adolescence. So if we start at early adolescence, you can see that the mood swings will probably kick in due to the hormones and the fluctuation of the different chemicals in our brain. You know, during middle adolescence, what I've just mentioned there, you know, they might be a bit hypersensitive and overreact. And again, thinking about this on the water, they might get frustrated to the point that they might start shouting out. Even at home, they might actually start overreacting when you ask them to do small chores. And then in late adolescence, this is where they'll start to become a lot more aware on how to cope themselves. But in the meantime, how can you help? So I guess firstly, great things never come. Firstly, great things never come from comfort zones. And adolescents actively crave risk and novelty to get that dopamine hit that we spoke about before. Therefore, encouraging positive risk taking will help reinforce what options to take. And at this point, a couple of you might be thinking, well, if I say do X, they'll do Y. But I think this then comes about keeping that open line of communication where you can. And don't get me wrong, I do appreciate that that might be difficult at times. But I think by persevering, hopefully, that line of communication will start to become open. In addition, when we speak about the calendar here, organization is such a great way to help develop that front part of the brain. This might be in the form of homework diaries and practice records. For instance, you might even share tips on how you organize your workload or show them your calendar of your workplace to give them some context. Again, this will keep a line of communication open whilst trying to help them to organize. One of the most important tips I can give is when your son or daughter has got the, let's face it, the chimp in control and maybe having a tantrum or being argumentative, try to remain calm. And I appreciate this is incredibly difficult, especially if you've had a bad day, but it could help them to see how you deal with challenging situations. You know, if you keep calm, you might actually become that really great role model. And even if it's little tactics that you take, like counting to 10 or taking deep breath afterwards, the keeping calm will hopefully help the situation to not get overboard and hopefully help them to calm down as well. And lastly, some of you may already do this, but talk to each other about strategies about how you handle certain situations. And this is not about being perceived as you don't know how to parent or a bad parent, but more you're proactively looking for solutions. And honestly, we're all here for each other at the end of the day. You know, support staff, coaches, parents, and and your son and daughter. If we're all on the same page, hopefully we can all help one another. So thank you again for tuning into this webinar, and I welcome any questions you may have.
So thank you there, Stephen. So there is the chat feature that we used during this presentation. So if anyone has any questions relating to this webinar and on the topic of the adolescent brain, you can drop your questions within that chat feature, and Stephen will be able to answer them for you. Whilst we wait to hear whether anyone has any questions, we did have a couple of questions which come through from some parents that weren't able to access this webinar this evening. So I'll kickstart off with one of the questions was relating to balancing training over competing. So being that adrenaline junkie. So that's some sort of, in a way, there's two sides to that, a coaching element and obviously the psychological element. So here we'll probably just cover more the psychological element. So what would you say regarding that question there, Stephen?
I think it's a very fair point. I think, to be honest with you, it is difficult because they've got so much energy and they want to compete. And I think really a simple thing that we could do, and again it goes back to this open line of communication, is asking them why they want to compete so much. And I know it sounds really silly because it'll be like, well, because I want to just do it and things like that. But then we can actually bring in another element of the psychology part, which is the growth mindset, because then we can turn around and say, well, one of the ways that you can be the best and what competes so well is by training. And again, this for me, if we're all singing from the same hymn sheet and we're saying that in order to develop, in order to compete and be chosen, training's required. And if they can put as much energy into the training, hopefully that's going to help them to get picked and chosen, and then they'll be able to compete more. But another way is to try and praise them for their training efforts. And actually, you know, that it's not all about competing, it is about the training in order to compete. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you for that. So another question that we had was, what is the best way to help an adolescent deal with disappointment?
Again, I think this is a great question. And it's, to be fair, I think each adolescent, each son daughter will be different. And I guess the best way to deal with disappointment is going to be different for each parent. How to react and respond around them, I think is always worthwhile. I think sometimes it might be just a case of saying that you're there if you need them. So that it's giving them the space, but letting them know that you're there to speak to. I appreciate that when you're trying to probably have that conversation, again, they might overreact. And in that moment, I guess, try and be patient where you can, and remain calm. And as I said in the tips, if that's just counting to 10, taking deep breaths, then again, that might help you to help them. It might be even a case of writing it in a journal. And again, keeping some structure that whatever happens during the training session, whether it's good or whether it's bad, that they write it in the journal. And maybe they have a conversation with you and reflect afterwards, once they've calmed down, why they felt like that initially.
A great answer, thank you. Yeah. The final question that we had come through was, I think you did cover a bit of this in the webinar, was advice on how adolescent brains perceive information differently to adult brains.
Yeah, I think, as I said throughout the webinar, it's more, I guess it's not as so much as the way that they perceive it, but the way that they process that information. And because unfortunately that the part of the brain that is processing the information isn't focused in the reasoning skills and executive functions, unfortunately, it's, I guess really it is kind of being patient again. Because it's just the way that they're processing that information. And again, you may know your son or daughter to want to have some space after they've perceived something that they see as negatively, or they might actually want to chat. One of the best ways to go about this is actually ask them how, if they deal with a difficult situation, how do they want you to act as well? And again, hopefully that answers the question.
Brilliant, thank you for that. Yeah, so if I don't think there's been any questions that have dropped through on the chat feature. So thank you for delivering the webinar this evening. Just to summarise, so you talked about the social pressures in today's society, in particular, trying to keep up with peer groups and the social media influence that is nowadays. We talked about the development of the adolescent brains and the different chemicals in the brain which fluctuate within adolescence, which sort of explains some elements of their behaviour. Talked about the chimp paradox, and there are times when that chimp takes over, and different tips and strategies which you can use to help your adolescent children. So this webinar, along with some additional resources, there are a couple of resources relating to the chimp paradox. They will all get uploaded onto the Talent Parent Programme webpage sometime next week. So they can read. You can read up on the elements of the adolescent brain, and in particular the chimp paradox. There, I know a question come through on recommended further reading. So that will be uploaded onto the Talent Parent Programme webpage, along with the different books that there are relating to that chimp paradox there. So thank you once again, Stephen, for delivering tonight's webinar. And
honestly,
thank you everyone for tuning in today.
No problem. Thank you.